Welcome to Sword and Shield, the official podcast of the 960th Cyberspace Wing. Join us for insight, knowledge, mentorship, and some fun as we discuss relevant topics in and around our wing. Please understand that the views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the U.S. Air Force nor the Air Force Reserve, and no endorsement of any particular person or business is ever intended.
This episode of the Sword and Shield podcast is intended for a mature audience, as the topic of suicide will be discussed. If you or someone you know is contemplating suicide, you can contact the National Suicide Lifeline at 988. So good day, gladiators. Thank you for listening to another episode of our Sword and Shield podcast. This is Francis Martinez, Director of Psychological Health for the 960th Cyberspace Wing, and I have two guests with me today. From the Pentagon, we have Major General Chaplain Solhjem, the U.S. Army Chief of Chaplains, and we also have the 960th Cyberspace Wing's First Sergeant, Master Sergeant Shatasha Estes. So thank you guys for both joining with us today.
This is Chaplain Solhjem. We're very happy to be here.
This is Master Sergeant Estes. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Chaplain Solhjem. Really looking forward to this conversation.
So Chaplain, I have seen a couple of your discussions and presentations, and that's why I wanted to have you be a part of this podcast today. But can you give us a little bit of your background and who you are and your history before we get started?
Sure. So I am the 25th U.S. Army Chief of Chaplains and a Major General, but of all the titles, I think I'm just the one that I'm most proud of is that I'm an Army Chaplain or the Army's Chaplain. And to be a part of this organization and support the men and women and the civilians and their families who serve is an awesome privilege, as we say that we are here to care for the soul of the Army, and we do it by investing in people, by connecting them in spirit and cultivating community. And one might think that, boy, you're the Chief of Chaplains for the Army. You probably have had a golden life, and you haven't had any difficulties or challenges. Well, that would be the furthest thing from the truth. So a little bit of my background. I grew up in what I would consider to be an idyllic childhood in rural North Dakota on a ranch, and enjoyed my youthful years very, very much, close family connections, community connections, and a religious upbringing. But during my formative years, we moved away from that setting and moved into the city. And during my formative years, my family of origin had a breaking up. My parents divorced, and the things associated with that. And my family system fell apart. And it began in me a downward spiral, which led to drug use and addiction. And it caused me to find myself in a place of difficulty where I was just running away and running to something. And that running to something was the United States Army. And this was back in 1973. On the delayed entry program, and right out of high school in 1974, I went into the military. And that military culture at that time was very troubled as we look at our environment today and see all of the fissures in our culture and the challenges that we face, and we often call the harmful behaviors in our military. I would invite you to go back in history and to understand it, that we have been in these places before, and in some ways in greater degrees of difficulty and peril than we are experiencing today. And there was a lot of racial problems in that Army, and a lot of other difficulties, the things that we deal with today, substance abuse and the way we treat each other. And I was making choices that were not healthy choices. My first duty assignment was in Bamberg, Germany, and all of the behaviors of my youth my rebellious youth found a perfect incubator in the Army of that era. I lost my rank multiple times. I had a couple of near-death experiences with drug overdoses and risk-taking behaviors. The big issue, and I know you often talk about things of leadership. There was really a lack of leadership in that culture, that Army culture. I ended up being sent to a psychologist for substance abuse, had a couple of sessions with them, but at the end of the day, the bottom line, I was not socially connected. I had acquaintances, but I didn't have people that really cared, and overcoming isn't something that we can necessarily do alone when we're in a hard place, and we need other people to come alongside and help. And the agency of that assistance for me was found in the person of a Sergeant First Class Doc McElroy, who was a person of faith. He happened to be a Christian, but he was also African American, and then, as I mentioned, the racial issues. So it wasn't natural to foster relationships or to reach out to people across racial lines, but he did. And through my relationship with him, from him asking me probably the most transformational question that anyone had ever asked me up until that point, when he saw the condition that my life was in, he asked me if my life was worth living this way. I knew the answer to that question, and through that relationship with him, I began to learn that I was here for a purpose, and that I was valued, and life did matter, and my life did matter, and that I had a purpose for being. And he helped me in that relationship to find that, both spiritually and in my own faith walk. And then he also realized that he was insufficient. As good as a non-commissioned officer, that I really needed somebody to come alongside. And so he introduced me to the chaplain. We didn't have one assigned to our unit, but a chaplain that was in the infantry unit there in Bamberg. And his name was Chaplain at that time, Captain Sam Sanford, and his wife Linda became acquainted with them. They took me into their world, and they began to invest in me. They invested themselves into my spiritual life, and ultimately, as we use common terms today, really started the journey of building spiritual readiness in my life. As a result of the investment of Doc McElroy and my newfound relationship with the Lord as a Christian, a person of faith, and the tutelage and mentorship of the chaplain, I'm sitting here today, these many years later, as the U.S. Army 25th Chief of Chaplains, and I could not have envisioned this kind of life and opportunity, but it all began with the connections that were made early in my life.
What do you think the transformation process that guided you, or that really stuck with you to really change your life from, those destructive behaviors to, committing and making that spiritual change?
Yeah, I think it was really realizing that I had value and worth to others. I think one of the biggest struggles we face in our culture today is social isolation. We have a generation now, or generations potentially, that lack connection. They are socially isolated, and my problems were emanating from the lack of connection, meaningful connection, and meaningful life purpose. So I think that on a spiritual path, spiritual life is so important. A lot of the issues that we immediately connote as behavioral or in nature are really have a spiritual root or foundation to those issues and problems. So I think unless a person really gets at the root causes, we're just simply treating symptoms. And I think the root causes in my life was brokenness, obviously relational brokenness, and then behaviors that ensued out of that, and that spiritual disconnect from my mooring. So as I mentioned early on, I grew up in a home, in a family of faith, but things happened in my life that caused that faith to be severely challenged and tested and even questioned. And I became disconnected. And it was people who cared, who helped me to regain those connections, I think is the reason that I was able to turn a corner And I mentioned also, hey, you don't turn those corners alone. And I think that's another issue in our culture today, that there's a self-sufficiency narrative that I can do everything myself, which really is not accurate, it's not healthy, and it's not helpful, that we really need meaningful relationships and connections with other people. So I think it was really knowing that someone cared and that I had value and worth and that my life mattered. And then when you know those things, then you begin to ask the deeper questions of, what do I do with my life now? A lot of those things, interestingly enough, happened. They were accelerated once I knew and understood who I was. The decision to become an Army chaplain occurred while I was still in Bamberg. And just a quick vignette, I was sitting in the chapel, where it's a place that I'd often go just for solitude and solace, to think and to pray and to meditate and potentially read scripture. And I was sitting there one day and I was thinking about my life, and I was uttering a little prayer, and I said, Lord, I am really thankful for where I am today. And I would do anything. I want to serve. I want to serve you. And I was sitting there thinking, what is it that I could offer up at this point? Because I really didn't, and I want to be really honest with the audience, that was an army back then that you survived. It was not one that you thrived in. And so I offered up this little Hail Mary, if you will, and I said, Lord, I'd do anything. And then I thought about Chaplain Sanford, and I said, you know what, I'd even be an Army chaplain. And something happened. I pivoted at that moment in that utterance. And if you would have met me outside of that chapel that day, and you would have walked alongside me and asked me what I was going to do in the future, my response, I believe, would have been, I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I think I'm going to be an Army chaplain. So when a person finds their sense of meaning and their reason for their existence and the opportunity to serve, that life is about serving, that's when the real powerful journey of one's life begins, I believe. Find your way.
Thank you, sir, for that. This is Master Sergeant Estes. You mentioned earlier when you were speaking about realizing the value and the worth that you bring to others. When did you realize how valuable in your experiences and everything that you had dealt with to that point would be beneficial to others?
Thank you for that question, First Sergeant. So I would tell you that the chaplain, what he did was amazing in the sense that he had me come alongside, and back in that environment, there were prisons in Europe. We had a lot of people incarcerated. A lot of our soldiers were incarcerated. So he would take me along with him and have me tell my story to the inmates. A few of them I actually knew. And I think that, to answer your question, that's when things really began to change, that I began to realize that, wow, I can impact other people through sharing with them my experiences and difficulties and challenges, and maybe helping them to realize that there's hope for them and that there's opportunity for them, even in a state of being incarcerated. So I think the chaplain really helped me to see and understand that I had a responsibility to be a steward of the goodness that had occurred in my life and to share that and invest it in other people. So I think that's what the chaplain really helped me to turn that corner, to take what was now my experience and then translate that into action that impacted people. And when you have those experiences, it fuels the flame to want to serve people in that capacity. So I think that's really where the roots of my calling originated from.
We talk about that connection, right? Building connections and getting that support. If it wasn't for that first person to really ask you and talk to you, it sounds like your life could have gone down a very different path. some people are scared, right? Or they're so involved in themselves, phones and things like that, that they are so, like you said, so disconnected. But I think it's important for us to realize that, when we see someone that's not connected, or when we see someone that is struggling, even though we might be scared of what the answer might be, is to really, ask them what type of help that they need, or how can we help them, or what do they need, and show that support. And you don't have to be a chaplain, and you don't have to be a first sergeant or a psychologist or a social worker to really engage with these people. It could be anyone. And it sounds like it was anyone, and that was available to you to really help you kind of go down that other path.
Yes, Francis, that's an excellent point. I think that is well taken in my sharing my story. I was not in a station in life where I was really a person of great consequence. I was just another soldier, right? At that particular juncture, a specialist, having attained that rank a few different times. But I think what we all have to is what you're kind of getting at is a little bit of risk aversion, the fear, the concern that, how someone might respond to my inquiry or to my simply asking a question. And I think so it's an attitude of that people matter. And I think the spiritual readiness, we talk about spiritual readiness, the spiritual life is a life of connections. It's caring enough about someone else to come alongside and just have a conversation. And I think sometimes because of the world that we live in and the digital and information age and the age of technology, it's a lost art. We don't know how to have interpersonal relationships and to ask meaningful questions. And what I find is that oftentimes when I speak to, say, younger soldiers and I just ask them a few questions, and I often get the response, nobody's ever asked me that before. And that's really kind of sad. Here you are, 18 to, 25 years of age, and you're really looking to find your way, and people haven't asked you kind of questions that can help you to begin the journey. And I think what it is that too, we have to be mindful that, like I described in my story, a lot of our people a lot of our service members and their families are coming from houses and not homes. They aren't coming from environments necessarily that cultivated that sense of community and connection and concern that comes in healthy relationships. And so what we have to recognize is that when we make those connections with people, we're helping them to find their spiritual legs, to find their sense of meaning and purpose. And so I think it's very, very important that every person listening today understands that you matter, and that you matter to other people, and that our disposition towards other people each and every day, I call them divine appointments, right? We keep them every day. We encounter people in all kinds of places, ways, and forms, and do we take the time to engage and to really care? And sometimes a couple of simple questions, maybe even one question, can make a huge difference in the life of a person. And yes, you don't have to be a trained professional to be able to have those kind of conversations.
Chaplain, this is Sergeant Estes again. I really do like how you answered that question, and it really has put things in perspective for me. When I've counseled airmen and, maybe talked to family members and friends, a lot of times individuals, especially if they're suicidal, they don't have hope because they are coming from those houses, like you said, and not homes. And a lot of times they're really searching for their purpose. And so for you to say you realize the value and the worth that you brought to other people is so profound, because I think people are just wanting a reason to give back, and they want to help, and they want to feel like they're contributing to something, even though they might have come from these broken homes, as you spoke of earlier. And so saying that they bring value and worth to a situation, an organization, a family, a friend is so powerful. So thank you for saying that. The next question I had was, when you were going through some of those changes that you mentioned when you were in Vandenberg and you were still in the enlisted corps, are there any other types of individuals or support that kind of helped you along the way, aside from Doc McElroy and Captain Sanford?
Yeah, so thank you for starting. The Army didn't have a lot of programs back in that era. And I think that the support mechanisms were limited, but they were present. It's just really that culture, the cultural picture that I painted to you was of a different time. And I think now today, just disposed in this culture, man, we have so many supporting agencies and helping agencies that provide support. It can almost be overwhelming in some sense, especially for leaders who are trying to navigate the trajectory of how people get assistance. I think the most powerful, profound assistance is a relationship, a meaningful relationship with another person. Anybody can provide that. And then in that meaningful relationship, there's something that's established. It's called trust. And when trust is established in a relationship with a person, then the discernment of, what is that service member or that family member, what is it that they need? I think that's another thing that is kind of a little bit of a challenge in our culture. And here's what I mean by that. It seems as though we've adapted a narrative today that every problem or every human condition or every difficulty is a behavioral health issue. And in the spiritual readiness initiative that we've conducted in the Army, I do that in concert with the Surgeon General, who is an advocate, spiritual readiness, with the Chief of Behavioral Health, who's also, and they understand the importance of spiritual formation and readiness to overall health and well-being and functioning. And so I think that what we are attempting to do, at least in the Army, and I know the other services are as well, is develop those qualities in a person so that in a time of stress or hardship or tragedy, that they have the wherewithal, they have the spiritual, psychological, physiological, religious, and values formation to help them in the strength of their character, their disposition, their decision making, and the integrity of those choices and decisions. So I think forming trusting relationships, developing and fostering an environment of care for others is part of what a healthy community should be about. People join the military because they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. They want to connect, and spiritual life helps them. I think what you're identifying, some of the harmful behaviors, is what's behind a lot of this, and the behavioral health professionals would be in agreement with everything that I'm saying. That what they often see is really something that could be dealt with by some other means. Just a relationship, a caring relationship with someone, could be the chaplain, could be a friend, it could be a family member. They just lack those kinds of things. And then I think that what the science and research shows us, the evidence-based research shows us that the most protective thing in anything that one could offer another human being is the spiritual dimension of readiness. As a matter of fact, the science shows that it is most protective when it comes to dependence, substance abuse and dependence in the lives of people, risk-taking behaviors, depressive disorders, major depressive disorders, and suicidality, especially when you link it with a personal faith and belief and shared community practice with others. And the numbers are astronomical. Substance abuse, it's 80% more protective. Risk-taking, it's 70%. Major depressive disorders, it's 60%, and suicidality, it's 50 to 80%. So having these connections and understanding the importance of spiritual life to thriving and to having a life worth living is absolutely critical and paramount to understand.
One of the things that we often hear, especially in a cyber-related environment, is the destigmatization is our goal. But it's like, if I go seek mental health, I'm going to lose my clearance. I'm going to get med boarded. All of these things, all of these fears come up, and so sometimes people don't seek the help, right? Or I don't want to get leadership involved. But you're proof that you can seek personal help and still have a successful career without experiencing any negative professional consequences. And I say any, loosely. But what is your message to listening service members and their families?
So I've held higher, but I currently have, in light of everything I've told you, I've divulged those things on every interview or assessment for a clearance or to be a part of some of the organizations that I've served in the military. They required high levels of security clearance. So I currently have a TSSCI. And the bottom line is it's obvious that I have those things, and yet I've acknowledged that I've had difficulties in the past. I've acknowledged that I've gotten help, and I've acknowledged that I'm better. And I think that there's a lot of inaccurate perception as it relates to getting help. One of the things that I would offer is where you go to get help. And so for example, the chaplain, if an individual seeking help goes to the chaplain, well, that conversation is confidential and privileged, meaning the individual owns the information. And the chaplain has, for example, no duty to report. So there is no duty to report, but that doesn't mean there isn't a responsibility to take action. Those are two different things. So the freedom and the latitude that a service member would have to go see the chaplain is probably the safest place that one could go. The chaplain is, as a matter of fact, by regulation and law and policy, required to keep that information that's privileged confidential. They cannot divulge it. In fact, they could be punished by UCMJ. So I would offer you to look at it maybe a little differently, that in fact, it is so protected that if anyone were ever to divulge it, they would suffer the consequences of breaching that area of trust between the individual and the chaplain in this context. But I think part of it is the culture that we create, and I think what it's going to take is it's going to take very senior people like myself or other senior people to come online and say, hey, I am not a perfect person, and hello, none of us are. And I've had difficulties in my life, and I needed outside agency, and it's okay. As a matter of fact, a really strong person recognizes it. I think it's a sign of strength. It's not a sign of weakness that you can self-identify that I need agency of other to work through a challenge or a difficulty. So I think it's the optics of seeing senior people willing to come out, and I applaud those leaders in our various services, and I know the Air Force has them as well, who are still serving, who have come online and said, hey, I went and sought help, and as a result, I'm here today and I'm serving. And I think those are powerful testimonials, as it were, that encourage people and kind of combat the issue of stigma that you're talking about.
Yes, sir. This is Sergeant Estes. So basically, you basically kind of quoted one of my favorite quotes, and it's transparency is actually a strength found in leaders. I know that some of the greatest leaders that I have followed have led with that transparency and opened up and showed that they were human too and that they had made mistakes. And I too have tried to mimic that leadership style and just being honest and letting people know that, hey, you're not the only person that has dealt with this. So have I, and this is what I did to mitigate those things. And so when we're talking about changing the culture of suicide prevention and with a more meaningful approach, how can we, as senior leaders, like you said, change that culture into more of a life worth living and make it a more positive approach, like you said in one of your videos?
Yeah, so I think the Army's embrace of spiritual readiness. Let me just start off with the suicide is very important. Suicides are devastating, and I think obviously the individual that makes the decision to take their life, they sadly that's a one act for them. But those who are left die 1,000 deaths. So the injury and harm that we do by extension when someone commits suicide, and I've been on that path, and when I think about it sometimes, what if, right? Well, I look at my family today, my wife of almost 45 years and my 4 children who are all married and 6 grandchildren. When I often talk to audiences, I put up that picture of my entire family sitting on a hay wagon back home in North Dakota. And then I flip to the next one and it's a blank page. Which picture do you want? In other words, my life mattered. And it matters to all of those people. And I think that what one has to realize is that every life is worth living. And hope is, we've discussed earlier the importance of hope. We have to instill in people hopeful outcomes in life. And I think that the messaging that every life is worth living, no matter what you have done, no matter what you're experiencing, someone cares. And so I think that the approach that the Army has taken by standing by and or with the Spiritual Readiness Initiative and leading it and allowing us to educate and train and develop these spiritual life skills in people is revolutionary. It's needed in our culture. It's needed in our military culture. And the increased emphasis that the Army has placed on this is helping. I believe it's what we are seeing now in some of the downward trends, i.e., even in suicide, where those things we're seeing impacts. And so I think it's very, very important, as you mentioned, transparency and connecting with people to helping them to understand that their life is worth living, even in the most difficult of circumstances, and giving them that reason to take the next step. I think in my life, Doc McElroy gave me the reason, the opportunity to take that next step. And so I'm eternally grateful for the people in my life. And I think it's a culture that we cultivate, a culture of care that we must cultivate in our military, because we're receiving into our military hundreds of thousands every year that are in that age 18 to 25 who are socially isolated, looking for meaning and purpose, coming from a culture and a society that is often isolated and disconnected. And we're also living in this information age, the digital age, that compounds it. We have a tremendous challenge, but we have a great opportunity to make a difference in the lives of young men and women as they join our military. And we owe it to their families. We owe it to the nation to get this right.
There are just so many great takeaways from listening to you today. And one of the biggest things that I heard you said it multiple times, is that connection, right? That connection, that support, and that transparency and building relationships. And so I am so grateful, Chaplain, that you were able to join to join us today and to speak to our listeners. I'm beyond grateful. I can't even say it. And there's nothing I can say to describe how I'm feeling right now listening to you.
Thank you. And obviously I'm wearing the uniform of the United States Army, but we're all in this together. So my counterparts, my other chiefs of chaplains, are not only dear friends and colleagues, but we all face similar challenges and we work together as a team. At the end of the day, you want a military that can fight and win our nation's wars. And our responsibility is to care for the soul of the people that do it and their families and ensure that we're investing in those people. And as I said earlier, connecting them in their spiritual life and the spirit with one another, and that we're cultivating a healthy community where people can thrive. As I mentioned to you, I came into the Army at a season where I was able to survive. But we need to create an environment and a culture in the military where people can thrive. So I want to thank the Air Force for leading the way today and reaching out and inviting somebody from another service from the Army of all things to join you and be a part of this discussion. I'm deeply honored. I feel privileged to be a part of this conversation because I think it's one of the most important conversations that we need to have in our society and in our military culture today.
Chaplain, this is Sergeant Estes. I second what Francis said. First of all, thank you for taking time out to speak to us today. I am just so honored, like she said, to have had this discussion with you. And I'm very thankful of your experiences that you had and the will and the power and the relationships that you developed to get you to where you are now, because, with you talking about leading the initiative and spiritual readiness and just the spiritual life skills, and then also giving a fit person back to society, caring for that soul. And so I really thank you for pushing this out and, again, speaking with us today. And from the bottom of my heart, I really thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. I appreciate what you're doing, and the audience listening today. Your life does matter, and every life is worth living. And I would encourage you, if you're having a dark night of the soul, somebody out there cares. Seek out that person who cares. Seek out that help, and give your life the opportunity it deserves and the people around you deserve as well. So bless you all. Thank you again for this engagement today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Shirt, for joining us today.
As always, if you're thinking of harming yourself, you can reach out to your leadership, chaplains, teammates, family, and friends. There is someone in your life who cares for you. You can also reach out to the National Suicide Lifeline at 988.
Thank you again, and Gladiators out.
Yep, Chaplain Solhjem out here. Thanks again. Deeply appreciated.